I'm going to let Jared introduce our speaker, and then we'll get right to the great content that's to come.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm really excited for tonight. This was kind of a bit of time in the planning and emerged very organically from some engagements and dialogue, especially between Jay McDaniel and Nicole, who we have here tonight. So I'm glad both of you were able to make it. And yeah, so we're sort of hoping to kind of rekindle and further explore some of these connections, points of contact, and symbiosis between Kyoto School thought and process thought. And Nicole recommended Carlos as a wonderful person to help begin that exploration. So Carlos is a professor of philosophy at Universidad Pedagógica Nacional in Bogota, Colombia. He's a member of the European Network of Japanese Philosophy and the Latin American Association of Intercultural Philosophy. His main research fields are Japanese philosophy, philosophy of religion. Some of his recent published papers include Nishitani and environmental ethics, the interdependent constitution of subjectivity and the socio-ecological challenges of the 21st century, an approach from Dogen, and Nishitani Keiji's notion of mind, which is especially what we will be diving into together tonight. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Carlos.
Well, thank you, Jared, and thank you everyone for inviting me. And I have to mention Nicole as well, who, as Jared mentioned, was the one who had the idea to bring me here. And well, I'm very happy this is happening. And well, one of the things, well, I need to say two things before going to the core of the topic today. The first thing is, well, this is something I wanted to explore since I finished my doctorate in my doctoral studies. The topic of my dissertation was Nishitani. By the way, I don't need to go into details because it was related to religion and non-reductionism and religion, but I realized that there were a lot of topics that I could develop from there, and the mind was one of them. And so as a result of exploring the topic, I published an article that, well, was mentioned earlier, that Jared mentioned, in Nishitani Keiji's notion of mind, that happened in 2019. But that's not like all of it. I've also had some notes on an article, a paper on the somehow the epistemic role of the qualitative side of experience, and that's something that's going to show. Well, I'm going to comment today at some point. So really, I understand, and well, for any Nishitani scholar or careful reader of Nishitani, it is clear that the mind is not one of the topics that he that was central to his philosophical project. At the same time, it is also clear that Nishitani's viewpoint is, I mean, somehow Nishitani, well, many people mention that many Kyoto School thinkers, and Nishitani was one of those members of the Kyoto School. Many Kyoto School members developed their philosophy in the crossroads between Western philosophy, especially German philosophy, and modern German philosophy, and Buddhist thought, Buddhist philosophy. And Nishitani is especially the case. He is especially explicit, and he doesn't fear quoting Zen teachers or Zen texts, texts from other Buddhist traditions as well. The Tendai school, for example, or the Pure Land tradition as well, but mainly Zen. And well, I mentioned this because given that the Buddhist standpoint is especially strong in Nishitani's philosophy, naturally the topic of the mind is of central importance as well. He didn't really explore the issue very explicitly, but it is clear to me now that it is important, it is relevant in his philosophy, and the things he has to say about the mind are relevant for us today as well. So, well, this is the first comment. The second comment has to do with Nishitani himself. Well, some of you may know a little about him, but I can't assume that everyone knows. Nishitani was 20th century Japanese philosopher. He belonged to the group that has been usually called Kyoto School, which is not exactly a school in the usual sense of the term. I mean, it's not like, it was not like a circle of people who one day gathered and decided, okay, let's start a school, let's call it Kyoto School because we're in Kyoto. It didn't come out like that. It actually was a somehow external denomination, and it just caught on. But well, one of the factors that are relevant to identify and define the limits of the Kyoto School is the founder, Nishida Kitaro. Nishida was also one of the main figures of Japanese philosophy, if not the main figure in Japanese philosophy in the 20th century. And what happened was that his originality and his insistence on trying to redefine his ideas over and over ended up in a very creative philosophy, and it attracted that career and his publication career attracted people from around Japan. Even at an early stage, he started in 1911. He published an inquiry into the good, or an inquiry into the good, in 1911, and that was a great success. In the 1920s and 1930s, many students from around Japan started arriving in Kyoto. By then it was called Kyoto Imperial University. Now it's just Kyoto University. And some of those students eventually developed strong philosophical connections with him, very often critical connections. And that's why we can call the Kyoto School, a philosophical movement, and not simply a Nishida club fan, a Nishida fan club. Sorry. I mean, some of his students decided to criticize the ideas of the teacher, and eventually that forced Nishida into rethinking his own ideas, and that is crucial for the richness, for the depth also of Nishitani's philosophical ideas, and for the development of the Kyoto School as well. Well, one of the central figures in Kyoto School philosophy was precisely Nishitani. He was born in 1900 and died in 1990, so he saw almost the whole of the 20th century. What a special place in history. And he was one of Nishida's closest disciples, and much of what is contained in Nishitani's ideas depends on Nishida's influence. Not only him, Nishitani read a lot of Western philosophy, especially authors such as Schelling, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger had a strong influence in his thought. But Nishitani didn't stop just at interpreting Western philosophy, and it was not the case of many Kyoto School thinkers. They tried to engage with Western philosophy, and the Buddhist standpoint was absolutely relevant for this. Well, I hope that's enough as an introduction. I can't talk too much about it because that's not the main topic today, but well, those are my two initial remarks. Anyway, so given that, well, I already mentioned, I think the topic of mind, even if it's not central concern, not explicitly in Nishitani's philosophy, I still think that he has a lot to say. Usually when people want to talk about Kyoto School philosophy and the philosophy of mind, the main figure is Nishida himself, Nishida Kitaro. There's much that has been written also about this, especially the notion of acting intuition. But I think Nishitani has something to say, and I still think there's much to research on the in that direction. So I would like to start from this image. So we can see here a person who could be any of you, any human being. So I just wanted a silhouette because of this. Someone who's walking, actually, and I wanted a silhouette of a walking person. And there's a reason for this. I'll explain it later. And we see this person is going toward a pine tree. So usually, well, this is I'm projecting the image because I want to start with a question. And well, it is a simple question to ask, but usually in philosophy, as you may know, well, you know, surely, that usually in philosophy, the simplest questions to formulate are the hardest to answer. Well, the question is, how does the person know the pine tree? How do we know things? How do we know the world? Well, if there are any comments about it, well, you can make your comments, of course, but well, not that you need to. Just I would just like you to reflect a little bit on that. And I wanted the image because this image will be relevant in our talk today. Usually, when we think about how we know things in the world, I mean, the traditional image is that there are things out there, and we are subjects, basically, we are subjects, and we, how we know ourselves, basically what we do to know ourselves is that we explore our own subjectivity self-consciously, and that's the way we know ourselves. And now, regarding how we know things in the world, then we go out there and explore things. We usually assume that things already have their own nature and features. We just need to go and take notes. That's it. But it's highly problematic. Well, it's been also in Western philosophy in the 20th century. There has been a lot of discussion about this. You may be familiar with some forms of criticism of this usual view of knowledge. Now the thing is, there is another question related to the question of knowledge. Usually, especially in our century, the issue is formulated like this: how do we have contact with the world? And apparently, this is a more basic question. So the issue is how do we have how does the mind, especially of course the human mind, have contact, or can it have any hope to have contact with things out there, things in the world at large? There is, I think, a problem in the way this question is approached, even in the way it is formulated. Because, well, if we notice, well, it's not easy to notice that usually this question is formulated from a framework from which we distinguish the subject and the object. That is, we take the subject-object dichotomy for granted. And the thing is, the subject-object dichotomy cannot be taken for granted at any level. It needs explanation. And the problem is, it is barely impossible to account for the subject-object dichotomy if we assume that they are separate from the start. So maybe we need an inversion here. The question would not be, how does the subject have contact, or how does the subjective mind, how does the mind have any contact with the world? The issue would be, how does the mind and the world tear apart? At which point do they split? Because the issue is usually when we think about this question from the subject-object framework, we start simply taking for granted that we are subjects and things are things. Subjects are subjects and things are things. But the thing is, the whole world is one. We are part of the world as well. At which point did we need to start asking the question, how do we get to know things? If supposedly we are part of this whole thing that is the world from the very beginning. How do we split from the world? I hope that would be a more productive way of approaching the question about knowledge and about the way the mind and the world enter into contact. So this is where Nishitani enters. The way that he approached, I'm going to go directly to the core of what Nishitani's notion of mind would be. And what I argued in my paper in 2019 was precisely that the center of Nishitani's notion of mind is an idea that can be called living co-projection. That is, the fact, in this case, the tree, and the mind, for example, my mind, are initially connected. They are tied together from the very beginning. There is a primary or originary connection between the mind and the fact. And so the task here, when we talk about how to know, if the question is how to know the pine tree, it cannot be put in the form of approaching the pine as an object of knowledge. When we approach it as an object of knowledge, it is already determined by our own conditions of knowledge. Interestingly, according to Nishitani, Kant did not invent out of scratch the Copernican turn, as he calls it. That is, it's usually commented in the history of philosophy, of course, that Kant inverts the usual terms of the epistemological quest. He says, instead of putting the conditions of knowledge in the object, let's put the conditions in transcendental subjectivity. So if reason, if the conditions for the possibility of any objective experience are given by transcendental subjectivity, it means that reason can know those conditions, and there is a hope then that to a certain extent there are things that we can say a priori about the world of experience. Of course, it does not mean that we don't need evidence. Of course, we need evidence. We need to gather evidence if we want to get to know the world. But the thing is that there are some things that are that we can take for granted. For example, the principle of causality. It is a condition for any object of knowledge to appear, among other things, space, time, cause and effect, etc. But what Nishitani comments on this regard is that actually what Kant does is to uncover the hidden relation between the subject and the object of knowledge. From the very beginning of Western philosophy, things are understood as substances. That is, everything is understood in terms of characteristics, a certain set of characteristics that the thing and only that thing has. When we determine the object in this way, we inadvertently put the subjective conditions of knowledge in the object. But the price that we pay is that we don't really get into contact with the real thing anymore, with a primal fact anymore, but only with a projection of our own prejudices. It seems a hopeless situation if we try to analyze it from idealism or from materialism. But the same problem emerges both in idealism and materialism. But there is an opportunity that we have here. there is a way to escape this trap. The problem is that if we insist on trying to formulate the epistemological quest in terms of an effort that we do, something that we will manage by ourselves, it will be hopeless. There is no way that can work, because as long as we approach the question for knowledge in terms of our own efforts, something that we do, it will always be a projection of our own prejudices upon real things, and they will turn out to be a shadow, an illusion. What is the solution? Interestingly, more than once in his main work, Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani Keiji quotes Ehe Dogen. He's mentioned here. You can see it in the in the bottom part of the handout here in this page. Especially, he quotes a certain passage of the Shobo Genzo, the chapter called Genjo Koan. The Genjo Koan, Dogen says, if the self, well, I'm trying to translate somehow literally here. I hope that doesn't make things hard to understand at this point. But well, anyway, Dogen's words. If the self advances to things to confirm them, to ascertain them, to know them, then that is illusion. If things advance to the self to confirm them, that is awakening. What Nishitani makes of this is, in this case, precisely the problem with both materialism and idealism is that precisely the self, or we, advance to things to confirm them. So we impose our own conditions of knowledge upon things. And in the long run, what we end up doing is projecting our own prejudices on them. But if things go the other way around, if things advance to the self to confirm them, then the self gets to know reality. It is a very complex issue how to interpret this passage, but I would like to single out one aspect. This implies that action is indispensable for knowledge. We need to engage in action. We cannot really get to know things as they are simply by observing them at a distance. And that sounds counterintuitive today, because it is frequently said that an indispensable condition for true knowledge of the world is objectivity. And if we want to be objective, we need to observe things at a distance. If we don't observe things at a distance, we end up projecting our own preferences or emotions upon things. But the irony is that if we cling to that view, we end up projecting our own biases, our own preconceived ideas upon things. It sounds counterintuitive, but it happens more often than not. It's been observed, for example, in the way that biologists in the West have treated evidence for several decades. Well, it's been revised recently, but for decades, it's been observed that biologists in Europe and North America projected their own ideas about sex upon the animal realm. Moral prejudices and social prejudices that were superimposed upon the realities of other animals. And so something else needs to happen. So to a point, it's not that the principle of objectivity is wrong. The problem is that it is limited. For real knowledge to occur, the real thing, or the manifold of things need to advance to the self to confirm them. And when that happens, that can only happen in action. The person needs to engage with things. The mind needs to engage with things. And the interesting thing is that the mind can engage with things, with primal things, primal facts, things as they are, because they are connected at bottom. The link between the mind and the primal fact, or the facts, real facts in general, can be called living co-projection. And this is an interesting concept. What Nishitani is saying here is that actually, yeah, to a point, it is true that the mind projects itself onto the fact. That's part of the quest for knowledge. But the other way around is true as well. I mean, the fact projects onto the mind. And in that way, mind and fact constitute each other. And that is impossible to understand if we assume that facts exist definitively in a certain form before we observe them. The act of observation is a participation in the way that things emerge every time. I mean, things do not pre-exist in an absolute sense. Things emerge into being at every moment. So, for example, I can say this is a pencil, and this pencil was, I don't know, there was a company made it, and I bought it at a store, and that's the end of the story. And there's nothing else. I could assume that the pencil hasn't changed, but the truth is that, well, the pencil changes. Everything in the world changes. This has been changing. It is it changes depending on the way I use it, because I use it. And it not only that, it changes because I have it, and because I observe it in a certain way, and the way I observe it and others observe it, it is a participation in the way the thing emerges at every point. It is indispensable to have this in mind. Things do not pre-exist in a definite form, in a static form. They change over time, and the way they change and they become what they are depends on the connections, on the living connections the thing has with other things. And that makes it possible to understand this notion of living co-projection. The mind participates in the becoming of things at the same time things participate in the becoming of the mind, of the individual mind. And if we then formulate now our question again, I mean, how do we get to know things? So it is not a matter of connecting to things that had nothing to do with us, but attuning with things. Because we already are connected to things, but we get lost somehow. It is comparable to, well, they're not so usual these days, but some of you had radios, and we had to tune up the radios. There are many things in many circumstances in life. We observe that we have to do the same thing. Like we need to tune up or attune with certain machines. We do that. Well, actually, for example, the whole of the internet depends on constant attunement. But it happens in many circumstances in life. It also happens at the level of our personal relations. If we enter into a certain personal relation, be it if we start a romantic relationship, or we start a work relationship, or we start having a friend at any level, if we started a relationship with someone, if we begin with a preconceived notion of what that relationship must be or should be, we tend to ruin it, because that will never be the case, precisely because that concrete relationship is a reality that develops over time. So we cannot, for example, if I have a partner and I have problems with my partner, and no formula about a good relationship will do if I don't attune with the concrete relationship that I am living. That is the point of knowledge then, and that's why it needs to be engaged. It cannot simply be a relationship of a distant subject observing an object. So one of the question would be, of course, but so how do we conceive of scientific knowledge if supposedly our enormously successful scientific knowledge has relied on the principle of objectivity? So the answer could be that maybe that's not so, not exactly. So maybe one thing is what makes science successful, and how we interpret it, how we account for its success may be another thing. Usually, and it would be interesting. I don't know if there is a history of scientific discovery, but there are some stories about how scientists make their discoveries that suggests that actually what happens is that they don't discover facts, or they don't crack the code of things simply by their own will, but actually things take them by surprise. Well, Alexander Fleming is a typical example. He made a terrible mistake, and that awarded him a Nobel Prize. But apparently Einstein, for example, also had something to say about this. He had mental experiments with images. He imagined himself going up and down on an elevator at a speed near the speed of light, and then try to imagine how things would move, and frames of references would move or would be influenced by that. And then when he had his image clear in his mind, he translated that into mathematical language. Some accounts suggest that actually, well, scientists need to work, they need to act. And we have said here, action is important. Action is absolutely relevant. But discovery is not something that occurs because we plan it. I mean, I can, for example, start a scientific project and start doing research. And at some point, well, I need a plan, of course. I need to make a plan. Otherwise, I would not get funds. But I cannot just say, well, after 3 or 5 years of research, or for example, if I start today in August 2024, we will make our first breakthrough. That's not something we can plan. That's something that happens, and it catches us in action, but it's not something that we plan. That suggests that Nishitani would be right. Discovery is not something that happens out of keeping objective distance, but it's something that occurs because we are engaged with things, and at some point things themselves reveal to us out of their own will, so to speak, not because we want them to do it. Then we delude ourselves into thinking that we discovered things. That didn't really happen that way. And there's much more to say, but it's a bit late, and I would like to hear from you as well. There are much to say, but it would be good to start hearing your questions at this point.